Elsa, a devoted but poor nun, balanced her days between faith and survival, working tirelessly at a shady hotel to support her struggling family. Despite the eerie atmosphere, she endured it all, believing her prayers would protect her. But one fateful night, as she walked home under the dim street lights, two men from her past emerged from the shadows. Their drunken laughter echoed through the empty street, but their intentions were anything but harmless. Trapped and terrified, Elsa realized too late that the secrets she had uncovered in the hotel's basement had made her their target. And now escape seemed impossible. Elsa was born into a poor family in a small town, where survival was a daily struggle. Her parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, but life always seemed to be one step ahead of them, throwing more challenges their way. Despite the hardships, Elsa was a dreamer. She longed for something bigger than the life she had known, a purpose that would give her peace and meaning. That purpose, she believed, lay in becoming a nun. Her inspiration came from her aunt, Sister Margaret, who had been a nun for many years. Margaret had dedicated her life to helping others, living a humble and pious life. As a child, Elsa had often visited her aunt at the convent and admired the simple yet spiritually rich life she led. The peaceful environment, the sense of duty, and the purposefulness of it all captivated Elsa, making her want to follow in her aunt's footsteps. However, things weren't as simple as they seemed. Sister Margaret, despite her noble work, lived on very little income. Being a nun did not pay much, and there were no financial rewards to speak of. Elsa's parents were aware of this reality and strongly opposed her decision to join the convent. They loved their only daughter dearly and had high hopes for her. In their eyes, Elsa was the key to a better life for them all. They envisioned her finishing her education, finding a good-paying job, and supporting them in their old age. "You don't have to live like your aunt," her father would say. "She may be content, but she's barely surviving. We want better for you and for us." Despite their concerns, Elsa couldn't let go of her dream. To her, becoming a nun wasn't about money. It was about serving others and finding inner peace. But she also couldn't ignore her parents' struggles. She knew they were depending on her. Torn between duty and dreams, she made a compromise. She would continue her religious training while working part-time to support her family. With this decision, Elsa took a job at a nearby hotel. The job wasn't glamorous, but it provided a steady paycheck, enough to ease her parents' worries. Every morning, she would attend her religious classes, learning the teachings of her faith and preparing for the life she longed to lead. In the afternoons, she would put on her work uniform and head to the hotel, where she cleaned rooms, served guests, and did whatever tasks were assigned to her. But deep down, Elsa was unhappy. The hotel environment felt cold and soulless, far removed from the peace and spirituality she craved. She despised the job, but knew she had no choice. Her parents often reminded her of the sacrifices they had made for her education, and she felt obligated to repay them. At night, when she lay in bed, Elsa would often pray, asking God for guidance. She hoped that one day she would no longer have to juggle between two conflicting worlds. But for now, she had to endure the struggle, balancing her spiritual aspirations with the harsh realities of life. As she cleaned hotel rooms and dealt with demanding guests, Elsa held on to her faith. In her heart, she believed that her path would eventually become clear. For now, she had to be patient. After all, even saints had their trials. From the very first day on the job, Elsa knew she didn't belong at the hotel. The atmosphere was far from what she had imagined when she agreed to work there. The dimly lit hallways, the strange guests, and the unsettling silence that crept in during the night shifts gave her a bad feeling. But her parents had insisted that she keep the job. "It's just temporary," they told her. "Once we're financially stable, you can do whatever you want." But something about the hotel felt wrong to Elsa, as if there were secrets hidden beneath its walls. The guests who checked in were often wealthy men with questionable behavior. Some were loud and arrogant, treating the hotel staff as if they were invisible, while others were overly friendly, making Elsa feel uncomfortable. She did her best to avoid any interaction beyond what was necessary. One evening, during a particularly quiet shift, Elsa was delivering fresh towels to a guest room when she accidentally took a wrong turn. She found herself in a corridor she hadn't seen before, leading to a small door at the end. Out of curiosity, she tried the handle, but it was locked. The air felt heavier there, and she quickly backed away, making a mental note to avoid that area in the future. But fate had other plans. A few days later, Elsa was cleaning a room on the hotel's lower floor when she saw the same small door left ajar. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hesitated. A part of her told her to walk away, but her curiosity got the better of her. Quietly, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. She found herself in a narrow staircase leading down to the basement. The further she descended, the colder and darker it became. The air smelled damp, mixed with the metallic scent of something she couldn't place. At the bottom of the stairs was a long hallway with several small rooms lining either side. Most of the doors were closed, but from one of them she heard muffled cries. Fear gripped her, but she pressed on. The door to the room with the cries was slightly open, and through the gap she could see someone sitting on the floor, their hands tied behind their back. The person was sobbing quietly, and bruises covered their face. Shocked, Elsa stepped back, her breath coming in short gasps. She hadn't realized that tears were streaming down her own face until she wiped them away. As she turned to leave, she noticed tools and equipment neatly arranged on the walls, tools that didn't belong in a hotel basement. Chains, whips, and other instruments of torture hung like sinister decorations. Her mind raced, and she could barely think straight. The place wasn't just unsettling. It was a nightmare hidden in plain sight. Without making a sound, Elsa sprinted back up the stairs, her heart thundering in her chest. She needed to get out of there. The hotel wasn't just a job she hated. It was a place of horrors she could no longer ignore. Elsa ran all the way home, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She could still hear the muffled cries from the basement echoing in her mind. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the door to her house and stepped inside, gasping for breath. Her mother, sitting at the kitchen table, looked up from her sewing. "What's wrong with you?" her mother asked, frowning as she noticed Elsa's pale face and tear-streaked cheeks. "I need to quit that job," Elsa blurted out. "Something horrible is happening in that hotel. There's a basement." Her voice broke as she struggled to explain what she had seen. She described the cries, the chained tools, and the fear that had consumed her. But instead of the support she desperately hoped for, her mother let out a frustrated sigh. "Elsa, we've been through this before. You always find something to complain about. Do you think people like us have the luxury to quit jobs just because we're uncomfortable?" "Mom, this isn't just about being uncomfortable. People are being tortured down there. I saw them with my own eyes." Elsa's voice cracked, but her mother remained unmoved. Her father, who had been quietly listening from the other room, stepped into the kitchen and crossed his arms. "Did you get paid on time this month?" he asked. Elsa blinked, confused by the question. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Answer me," her father insisted. "Yes," she replied reluctantly. "Well then, that's all that matters," her father said firmly. "As long as you're getting paid, don't concern yourself with what the hotel does or who stays there. It's none of your business." "How can you say that?" Elsa's voice rose. "You want me to ignore what I saw as if it doesn't exist?" Her mother reached out and gently touched her arm, trying to calm her down. "Elsa, we understand you're scared, but sometimes you have to be practical. We're struggling, and this job is helping us survive. You can't throw that away." Elsa pulled her arm away, tears streaming down her face. She had always seen her parents as her support system, but now they seemed to be standing on the opposite side of a moral divide. How could they be so indifferent? Desperate for a solution, Elsa locked herself in her room and prayed for guidance. Her faith had always been her refuge, but tonight, even her prayers felt hollow. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the haunting images from the basement. The next morning, her parents pressured her to return to work. They insisted that quitting wasn't an option, and as much as Elsa wanted to refuse, their voices rang with desperation. She hated the job, but she hated disappointing her parents even more. Reluctantly, she agreed to go back. But deep down, she knew she couldn't stay silent for long. Something had to change, even if no one else believed her. The next day, Elsa walked into the hotel with heavy steps, her heart weighed down by fear and uncertainty. Everything around her, the reception desk, the bellhop, the clinking of dishes from the restaurant, felt like a facade hiding something much darker. She couldn't shake the images of the basement from her mind. Each sound she heard seemed like a cry for help, but no one else appeared to notice the sinister undercurrent that ran beneath the hotel's polished exterior. As she carried out her duties that day, Elsa remained distant, her thoughts consumed by the horrors she had witnessed. She scrubbed floors, changed bed linens, and delivered towels on autopilot. But with every task, her resolve grew stronger. She couldn't continue like this. Her parents wanted her to stay quiet, but how could she live with herself knowing she had ignored those cries? That night, Elsa made up her mind. If her parents wouldn't support her and if the church couldn't intervene, she would have to seek help from someone else. She thought of her aunt, Sister Margaret, who had always been her moral compass. Visiting the convent felt like her last hope, and the next morning she made her way there. As Elsa sat across from Sister Margaret in the quiet comfort of the convent, she explained everything: the hidden basement, the cries, the torture equipment, and her parents' refusal to believe her. But instead of the reassurance she was hoping for, her aunt's expression darkened. "You need to stay away from this, Elsa," Sister Margaret said firmly. "I know you want to help, but the world is cruel. Sometimes, no matter how righteous your intentions are, fighting powerful people can only bring harm." "But I can't just ignore it," Elsa replied, tears pooling in her eyes. "What if someone dies down there?" Sister Margaret sighed and took Elsa's hands in hers. "Pray for them, my dear. Sometimes prayer is the only power we have." But Elsa wasn't satisfied. She needed to do something more tangible. Later that afternoon, with shaky hands and a pounding heart, she walked into the local police station. She hesitated by the entrance, her nerves threatening to paralyze her. What if they didn't believe her? What if the hotel owner had already bribed them? Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside and approached the officer at the desk. "I need to report something," she said, her voice trembling but determined. She described the hotel basement and what she had seen, expecting the officer to react with shock or concern. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a knowing smirk spreading across his face. "The owner of that hotel is a well-respected man in this town," he said, his tone dripping with dismissal. "I suggest you mind your own business before you get yourself into trouble." Elsa's heart sank. She had hoped the law would protect her, but instead it seemed the police were part of the same web of corruption. As she left the station, tears streamed down her face. She realized that she was more alone in this fight than she had ever imagined, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. Her next steps would have to be smarter. The morning after her failed attempt to seek help from the police, Elsa woke up with a sense of dread gnawing at her stomach. The rejection and dismissal she had faced at the police station still stung. How could they turn their backs on something so serious? But despite her disappointment, she knew she couldn't let fear paralyze her. As she got ready for work, her parents once again reminded her of the importance of keeping the job. "Whatever is happening at that hotel, it's none of your business," her father said, sipping his tea. Just do your job and stay out of trouble." Elsa nodded, but deep down she knew she couldn't suppress her instincts forever. However, for now, she had no choice but to return to the place that haunted her. She needed time to figure out her next move. At the hotel, everything seemed normal on the surface. The guests checked in and out, the staff moved about in their usual routines, and the sound of luggage wheels echoed across the marble floors. But Elsa couldn't help but feel that someone was watching her. Paranoia set in as she carried out her tasks, constantly glancing over her shoulder. By midday, a fellow staff member approached her in the hallway. "The manager wants to see you," the young girl whispered, her voice laced with concern. Elsa's stomach tightened as she tried to steady her breath. She had been expecting something like this ever since she spoke to the police. Had her complaint already reached the hotel management? Elsa walked through the long corridor leading to the manager's office, her footsteps echoing louder than usual. Her palms were sweaty and her heart raced as she knocked on the heavy wooden door. "Come in," a stern voice called from inside. The manager, a man with sharp features and cold eyes, sat behind a large desk cluttered with papers. He gestured for Elsa to sit, but she hesitated. His gaze pierced through her, making her feel small and exposed. "I heard you've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong," he said, leaning forward slightly. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying threat in his tone. Elsa's mouth went dry. "I haven't done anything wrong," she managed to say. The manager chuckled darkly. "You see, the owner doesn't like people interfering in his business, and I don't like having to clean up messes caused by employees who don't know when to keep quiet." Elsa's heart pounded as he continued. "If you ever step foot in that basement again, or mention what you've seen to anyone else, you'll end up there yourself. Do you understand me?" Tears welled up in Elsa's eyes, but she fought them back. She nodded, unable to speak. "Good," the manager said, leaning back in his chair. "Now, go back to work and pretend this conversation never happened." Elsa left the office, her legs trembling. The weight of the threat hung over her, suffocating her spirit. But as scared as she was, she couldn't ignore the thought circling in her mind. She had to find a way to expose the truth before it was too late. Days passed, but the weight of the manager's threat never left Elsa's mind. She felt trapped, like a bird locked in a cage, suffocating in silence. The once simple tasks of cleaning rooms and assisting guests now felt unbearable. Everywhere she turned, she imagined eyes watching her, making sure she stayed in line. Her faith was the only thing keeping her grounded, but even her prayers were now laced with fear. How could she continue living like this? But no matter how hard she tried to suppress her instincts, the cries she had heard in the basement echoed louder with each passing day. The memory of those tools hanging on the walls haunted her dreams. She knew something evil was happening below the surface, and the guilt of doing nothing about it was eating her alive. Every time she passed the staircase that led to the basement, her feet would slow, and her eyes would linger. She could feel the pull, an irresistible urge to know the truth. One afternoon, when the hotel seemed quieter than usual and the staff's watchful eyes were nowhere to be seen, Elsa decided to take a chance. Her heart pounded as she carefully made her way to the basement staircase, checking over her shoulder to ensure no one was following her. The air grew colder with each step, and her breaths became shallow. She told herself this was the last time she would do this. She just needed to see if someone was still down there, if they needed help. When she reached the basement, the dim light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The corridor stretched before her, its silence broken only by the faint sound of muffled cries, just like before. Her hands trembled as she walked past the rows of closed doors. Then she noticed something unusual, a ring of keys lying on a table against the wall. Without thinking, she picked up the keys, her mind racing. One of these keys could open the doors where the cries were coming from. Maybe she could help someone escape, just like she had dreamed of doing since the day she first discovered the basement. Her fingers fumbled through the keys as she approached one of the locked doors. Her breath was uneven, her heartbeat deafening in her ears. Finally, the key slid into the lock, and with a soft click, the door opened. The room was dark and cold, the faint smell of dampness in the air. As she stepped inside, her foot accidentally kicked something, a metal bucket which clanged against the floor. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The cries stopped, and an eerie silence consumed the space. Before Elsa could react, a sudden movement from the darkness caught her attention. A loud thud echoed, followed by a sharp pain as something hit her forehead. She gasped and stumbled back, blood trickling down her face as she fell to the floor. The world around her spun, and just before everything went black, she saw two figures rushing past her, two young men escaping from the room. The last thought that flickered through her mind before she lost consciousness was, "What have I done?" When Elsa regained consciousness, her head throbbed and her vision blurred. The cold floor beneath her felt damp, and a metallic taste lingered in her mouth as blood trickled down her forehead. She blinked, trying to focus, as distant footsteps echoed down the hallway. Panic set in when she realized where she was, the basement, the very place she had been warned to avoid. She tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled, and the pain in her head made her dizzy. Flashes of what had just happened flickered in her mind. The door, the keys, the clang of the bucket, and then the sudden attack. Who had hit her, and why had they run away? She remembered seeing two young men emerge from the darkness, their faces a blur as they fled the room. Were they prisoners trying to escape, or had she interrupted something much worse? Elsa's breathing grew shallow as she fought to stay calm. She couldn't stay here. Someone would find her, and if it was the wrong person, she knew her fate would be sealed. The manager's threat echoed in her mind. "You'll end up in the basement yourself." She had never imagined how real that warning could become. Using the wall for support, she managed to get to her feet. Her legs wobbled, and every step felt like an uphill battle. She clutched her head, her fingers sticky with blood, and bit her lip to keep from crying out in pain. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, the dim light casting shadows that seemed to move and whisper. She needed to find the stairs and get out before anyone noticed she was missing. As she stumbled forward, she heard a noise behind her, a faint creak, as if someone had just opened a door. Her heart nearly stopped. Was someone following her? Were the men who had attacked her coming back to finish the job? She didn't dare look back. Instead, she quickened her pace, praying that her trembling legs would carry her far enough. Finally, the staircase came into view. Relief washed over her as she gripped the handrail and dragged herself up the steps. Her vision blurred again, and she nearly slipped, but she forced herself to keep moving. The air grew warmer as she ascended, a sign that she was getting closer to safety. Bursting through the door at the top of the stairs, Elsa gasped for air as if she had been underwater. The hotel's familiar sights and sounds surrounded her. Guests chatting in the lobby, the clinking of silverware from the restaurant, and the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner. It felt surreal, as if she had crossed from one world into another. Without wasting a second, she made her way to the staff restroom. Locking the door behind her, she sank to the floor, her breath hitching as tears streamed down her face. She was safe for now, but deep down she knew this wasn't over. Whatever was happening in the basement had nearly cost her everything, and she couldn't escape the haunting thought. What if it happens again? Elsa barely had time to process the blood dripping from her forehead before she was called into the manager's office. Her heart pounded with dread as she made her way down the long corridor, each step feeling heavier than the last. She could feel the warm trickle of blood drying against her skin, but she didn't care. All she could think about was the punishment waiting for her behind the heavy wooden door. When she entered the office, Her eyes immediately darted to the two figures standing inside, the hotel owner and the manager. Their faces were cold and stern, like wolves circling a wounded prey. Elsa swallowed hard, trying to stand tall despite the fear coursing through her veins. "You really couldn't help yourself, could you?" the manager sneered. "We warned you to stay out of the basement, but you just had to go back." The hotel owner's voice was even more menacing. "I should have her fired right now," he growled. "Or better yet, thrown into that very basement. She deserves to know firsthand what happens to people who cross me." Elsa's legs trembled and she felt her breath hitch. The threat was real, and she knew they were capable of making it happen. Just as the owner took a step toward her, the door behind her creaked open. She turned to see someone she hadn't expected, Father Joseph from the church. The sight of the priest gave her a sliver of hope, though she wasn't sure if even he could save her now. Father Joseph walked into the room with calm authority, his presence immediately altering the tension in the air. He looked at Elsa, his gaze softening when he saw the blood on her face. "What is the meaning of this?" the priest asked, his voice measured but firm. The owner scowled. "This girl is a liability. She's been snooping around, interfering in matters that don't concern her. We warned her, but she didn't listen." Father Joseph raised a hand, silencing the man. "I understand your frustrations, but Elsa is a devoted member of our church. She may have made a mistake, but I won't allow her to be punished so severely. Let me handle this matter." The owner narrowed his eyes, but the priest's calm resolve didn't waver. "I will take responsibility for her actions," Father Joseph continued. "She will not interfere again. I give you my word, but I insist that you allow her to keep her job. For her, this isn't just a job, it's her family's survival." The room fell silent for a moment before the owner reluctantly nodded. "Fine, but this is her final warning." Father Joseph turned to Elsa and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Come with me," he said softly. She followed him out of the office, her legs barely able to carry her. As soon as they were outside, Elsa broke down, sobbing into the priest's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered through her tears. "Be careful, my child," he said gently. "You've escaped this time, but next time they may not show mercy." Elsa nodded, knowing the danger was far from over. After a few days of rest and recovery, Elsa returned to the hotel. Her wound had begun to heal, but the scar on her forehead was a constant reminder of the nightmare she had survived. Father Joseph's words still echoed in her mind. "Be careful, my child. Next time they may not show mercy." She promised herself that she would avoid the basement and stay out of trouble. She had come too close to disaster, and her parents couldn't afford for her to lose the job. As she tied her apron and started her shift, she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with the manager and other senior staff. The hotel felt colder than before, as if the walls themselves were watching her every move. Her paranoia grew, but she kept moving, silently praying for the day to pass without incident. After her shift ended that evening, Elsa left the hotel, her bag slung over her shoulder. The cold night air hit her face, but she welcomed it. It was a refreshing change from the suffocating atmosphere inside. As she walked down the narrow street toward home, she tried to clear her mind of the hotel's dark secrets. But fate had other plans. Halfway down the street, she heard voices, loud, slurred, and familiar. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned to see two young men leaning against the wall of a dimly lit alley. Her blood ran cold when she recognized them, the same boys who had rushed past her in the basement after she unlocked the door. Their faces were clearer now. They were disheveled, their clothes wrinkled, and the smell of alcohol lingered in the air around them. "Hey, isn't that the girl from the basement?" one of them said, nudging the other. His words were slightly slurred, but the recognition in his eyes was sharp. The other boy grinned wickedly. Yeah, it's her. She's the one who set us free. Elsa's breath hitched as she took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. But her fear had paralyzed her momentarily, and before she could move, one of the boys took a step toward her. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice mocking. "You owe us for getting us out of that hellhole." "I don't owe you anything," Elsa managed to say, her voice shaking. The boys laughed, their drunken amusement echoing through the empty street. Elsa turned on her heel and bolted, her legs moving as fast as they could carry her. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of her footsteps mixing with the boys' taunts behind her. "Come back, sweetheart," one of them yelled. "We just want to thank you properly." Ignoring them, Elsa ran faster, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She darted through side streets, weaving through alleys, until the boys' voices faded into the distance. When she finally reached the safety of her home, she collapsed against the door, tears streaming down her face. She had thought the basement was the only danger she faced, but now the danger had followed her into the outside world, and it wasn't going to stop any time soon. The events of that night stayed with Elsa like a shadow, haunting her every thought. She couldn't sleep, eat, or focus on her job without remembering the boys' mocking voices, their footsteps chasing her down the dimly lit streets. She had barely escaped that night, but she knew it wasn't over. They had recognized her, and worse, they knew where she worked. Every time she stepped outside her home, she felt as though they were watching her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Despite her fears, Elsa tried to act normal at the hotel. Her parents depended on her income, and she couldn't let them see the anxiety that threatened to consume her. But paranoia crept in with every task she performed. She avoided eye contact with guests, stayed away from empty hallways, and made sure she was never alone. Even then, her mind constantly replayed the scene of the boys calling out to her. One evening, after a long shift, Elsa gathered her things and prepared to head home. The streets were quieter than usual, the lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. She clutched her bag tightly as she walked, her eyes scanning every alleyway and corner. The wind howled softly, making the empty street feel eerie and endless. As she turned onto a familiar street that led toward the church, she heard footsteps behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. She quickened her pace, but the footsteps grew louder, faster. She glanced over her shoulder and froze when she saw them, the same two boys from the alley. Their clothes were just as disheveled as before, and their eyes gleamed with the same drunken recklessness. "Well, well," one of them sneered, his voice echoing in the night. "Fancy meeting you here again." Elsa's pulse raced, and without thinking, she broke into a sprint. Her shoes pounded against the pavement, the cold night air cutting through her lungs. The boys laughed behind her, their footsteps closing the distance. "Come on, don't run," one of them shouted. "We just want to talk." Elsa didn't look back. She knew that stopping would mean the end. She needed to reach somewhere safe, somewhere with people who could help her. Her mind raced as she searched for an escape route. The church was just a few streets away, but she wasn't sure she would make it in time. She darted down a narrow alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of side streets. But as she rounded a corner, her foot caught on a loose stone and she stumbled, falling hard onto the cold ground. Pain shot through her knee, but she ignored it, scrambling to her feet as the boys' voices drew nearer. Just as she was about to run again, they cornered her, blocking both sides of the alley. Her heart sank and tears welled up in her eyes. "Please, just leave me alone," she whispered. One of the boys grinned, stepping closer. "Not this time." Elsa's mind screamed for a miracle, but she had no idea if one would come. Elsa backed away until her shoulders hit the cold brick wall behind her. Trapped. The two boys stood in front of her, their grins twisted with drunken confidence. She clutched her bag tightly against her chest, her breaths coming in rapid gasps as she searched for any escape. But there was none. "Didn't we tell you we wanted to thank you?" one of them sneered, stepping closer. "Please," Elsa begged, her voice trembling. "I helped you. I set you free." "Oh, we remember," the other boy said, his tone mockingly sweet. "That's why we're here. You don't get to walk away from that without a proper goodbye." Before she could scream, one of them lunged forward, clamping a hand over her mouth. Elsa struggled, kicking and flailing, but their grip was too strong. Tears streamed down her face as she fought to free herself, but it was useless. They shoved her toward a parked car at the end of the alley, its engine already running, as if they had been planning this all along. "No!" Elsa tried to scream, but the hand over her mouth muffled the sound. Her heart pounded in terror as they dragged her toward the car. She thrashed wildly, her mind racing for a way out, but the cold night seemed to swallow her cries. One of them opened the car door, and before she knew it, they shoved her inside. "Drive!" one of them barked, as the other boy slid into the passenger seat. Elsa lay on the back seat, her wrists pinned under their weight as the car sped off into the night. She squirmed, trying to break free, but the more she fought, the tighter their grip became. She could barely breathe, panic overtaking her. "Stop struggling," one of them growled. "You'll only make this harder on yourself." Desperation filled Elsa's chest as she tried to think of anything that could save her. She thought of Father Joseph's warnings, of her parents' desperate need for her income, and of the basement that had started it all. How had things spiraled so far out of control? Her tears soaked the car seat beneath her, and for the first time she felt truly hopeless. The car sped down empty streets, eventually turning onto a dirt road leading away from the town. The streetlights faded, replaced by darkness and the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires. Elsa's sobs grew quieter as exhaustion and fear consumed her. Her body felt limp and she could no longer fight. Finally, the car came to a stop in the middle of an isolated area. The boys opened the door and yanked Elsa out, her legs barely able to support her. The cold air bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped her soul. As they dragged her toward an abandoned building, Elsa silently prayed for a miracle. She didn't know if anyone could save her, but she had nothing left to lose. All she had was faith, and even that was slipping through her fingers like sand. The cold wind howled around Elsa as the boys dragged her toward an old abandoned warehouse, its broken windows and peeling walls casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, but she didn't have the strength to resist anymore. Her legs wobbled, her breaths came in short gasps, and tears blurred her vision. She knew that no one was coming to help her. They had driven far from the town, away from any sign of life. The boys laughed as they pushed her through the creaky metal door and into the dimly lit interior. The warehouse was empty except for scattered debris, broken furniture, and the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. Elsa stumbled and fell to her knees, her palms scraping against the cold, dusty floor. "Look at her," one of the boys sneered. "Crying already? We haven't even started." Elsa's body shook as she crawled backward, trying to put as much distance between her and them as possible. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Let me go. I won't say anything. I promise." The boys ignored her, their eyes glinting with malice. One of them grabbed her by the arm and yanked her to her feet. She cried out in pain, but he only laughed. "No one's going to hear you out here," he said coldly. "So go ahead, scream if you want." Elsa's heart sank. She had never felt more alone. Desperation clawed at her chest as she thought of her parents, of the life she had tried to build, of the dreams she once had of becoming a nun and living a peaceful, meaningful life. Was this how it would end? Was this the moment her life would be taken from her by cruel, violent hands? As they pushed her against the wall, she felt her body go limp with fear. But in the depths of her despair, a thought emerged, one last hope. She closed her eyes tightly and began to pray, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Jesus, help me, please. I am your servant, your child. Don't leave me now. I need you." Her sobs turned into desperate, pleading cries as she repeated the prayer over and over, her words filled with the last ounce of strength she had. The boys hesitated for a moment, exchanging uneasy glances as her prayers grew louder. "She's a nun, man," one of them muttered. "This feels wrong." The other boy scoffed, brushing off his friend's concern. "It's just a prayer. She's not going to be saved." But as Elsa continued to cry out, something changed. The wind outside intensified, howling like a storm closing in. The air inside the warehouse seemed to shift, growing heavier with each passing second. Suddenly, a bright flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by the deafening roar of thunder. The boys flinched, stepping back instinctively. Fear flickered in their eyes as another bolt of lightning struck, closer this time. The storm wasn't normal. It felt like something more, as if her cries had been heard by something far greater than them. The warehouse trembled as thunder roared once again, shaking the ground beneath them. The boys, who moments ago had been full of drunken confidence, now stood frozen, their fear evident as they watched the storm rage outside. Elsa remained huddled against the wall, her tear-soaked face lifted toward the ceiling as she continued her desperate prayer. "Jesus, please, don't let them hurt me. Save me," she whispered, her voice cracking as she sobbed. The wind outside grew stronger, howling like an angry force ready to tear through the building. The temperature seemed to drop, and the flickering light from the broken windows cast eerie shadows across the walls. One of the boys shifted nervously. "Man, this isn't right," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "She's a nun or something. What if this is a curse?" "Don't be stupid," the other boy snapped, though his voice was shaky. "It's just a storm." But his confidence wavered when another bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, lighting up the warehouse like it was the middle of the day. The thunder followed immediately, shaking the walls with such force that dust and debris fell from the ceiling. The boys backed away from Elsa, their bravado crumbling with each second. "I told you this was a bad idea," the first boy said, panic rising in his voice. "Let's get out of here before something happens." But the second boy wasn't ready to give up. "We've already gone too far. No one's coming to save her." Just as he reached for Elsa again, the air seemed to shift. A blinding flash of lightning struck the ground just outside the warehouse, its brightness seeping through the cracks in the walls. The thunder that followed was deafening, as though the heavens themselves were unleashing their wrath. Suddenly, the second boy screamed, clutching his chest as he stumbled backward. His eyes widened in terror, and before Elsa could comprehend what was happening, the first boy collapsed next to him, writhing on the floor as if invisible flames were consuming him. The scent of burning filled the air, and their screams echoed throughout the warehouse. Elsa, still huddled against the wall, watched in shock and horror as the boys' bodies convulsed violently, their screams turning into gurgled gasps. The lightning flashed again, illuminating their twisted, agonized faces one last time before they fell silent. The air grew still, and the only sound remaining was Elsa's ragged breathing. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her mind was racing, her body frozen in place. She had prayed for help, but she hadn't expected this, a divine intervention that had struck down her attackers with terrifying precision. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Thank you, Jesus. Thank you." Summoning her remaining strength, Elsa forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled, but she managed to stumble toward the door of the warehouse. The storm outside had calmed, the wind now a soft breeze. As she stepped into the night, she realized she had survived something she never thought she could. But this wasn't just survival. It was a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it.